There's no question the ESPN and Netflix documentary Last Dance has given sports enthusiasts like myself life during this time where sports have been on hiatus. People who were fans back in the 90s get to relive the glory days of the Jordan era, and those who may be younger and perhaps only know Jordan as a symbol on their shoes have gotten to experience what all the fuss has been about. Hopefully this documentary puts to rest any lingering question as to who is the greatest player of all time. Let's be clear, Jordan was not just a great player, he was the greatest of the great, the alpha of the alpha, the creme de la creme. But this documentary has also brought back into the forefront one of the most controversial aspects of the Jordan personality, and that is at the height of his stardom, his decision to remain neutral on social and political issues, particularly those involving race. Now, there's a long history of great athlete activists who made it part of their mission to use their platform as a way to bring issues of social justice to the forefront in hopes of moving the needle forward. We saw this with Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and Peter Norman. And today we've seen the resurgence of the athlete activists through people like Colin Kaepernick and LeBron James. But something happened between the 1980s and the early 2000s. For Black athletes, there was generally a lapse in indignation for racial injustice. So what happened? Why did Jordan refuse to speak up when communities of color needed his voice most? When teenagers were fighting and killing each other over his sneakers, he only said they should give up the shoes without a fight. When news emerged about Nike's use of Asian sweatshops, he said, "I'll look into the problem." And of course, he refused to publicly support Black Democrat Harvey Gantt in his 1996 campaign against former segregationist Jesse Helms for a U.S. Senate seat, where Jordan is now infamously quoted as saying, "Republicans buy sneakers too." He wasn't obligated to be political or speak out on racial injustice, but he had an opportunity like none other. Given the racial challenges in America, why did the greatest athlete in the world and most recognizable man choose not to use his position to speak out and mobilize Black athletes in the cause of racial equality? Well, the truth is, the problem of neutrality was not unique to MJ, but affected a generation of Black athletes. Let's break down the construct of a politically neutral superstar. So I gotta start with the story of David and Goliath. David is this shepherd boy, and his three older brothers are serving in King Saul's army. One day, David's father sends him to the battle site with food for his brothers. So David makes his way to the front lines. He gets there, and he's chatting up his brothers when the big 9-foot giant Goliath comes strutting around, shouting his taunt, "I'm the Philistine champion. I will defy Israel today. Come battle me. You will be our slaves." I'm paraphrasing, of course. So he's repeating this taunt over and over, and King Saul and all his soldiers are petrified. Young David sees this, and he's perplexed. How could this uncircumcised Philistine continue to defy the armies of the living God and no one step up to the plate? So as he's wondering this out loud, his oldest brother, filled with all kinds of shadiness, says to him, "What are you doing here anyway? What happened to all the little sheep you're supposed to be taking care of?" At that point, David, filled with indignation, utters one of the most epic questions. Is there not a cause? In other words, is this not a time to take a stand? Is there not something worth fighting for? For Black athletes prior to the 1980s, the cause was always obvious. Since the days of slavery, Blacks in America had been engaged in the active fight for equality. The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s saw a generation united for change. At the time, there were Jim Crow laws and racial segregation in schools, segregation in public transit, restrooms, water fountains. The Black community came together for bus boycotts, sit-ins, and protests. You see, for the civil rights generation and generations prior, the cause for racial justice was always clear. The efforts of activists and countless protesters of all races brought about legislation to end segregation, Black voter suppression, and a lot of discriminatory employment and housing practices. The landmark decision of the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, ruled that laws establishing racial segregation in public schools were unconstitutional. Soon universities began to integrate. 26 years before Jordan attended the University of North Carolina, he wouldn't even have been allowed to enroll. and by the early 1970s, the term post-racial was being used to describe America after the Civil Rights Movement. While there may still be some instances of prejudice, the belief was that it wasn't a blatant or institutionalized part of the daily lives of Black people in America anymore. And if you work hard, do the right thing, and stay out of trouble, racism couldn't limit you, couldn't kill you, and was no longer a hindrance to any kind of social mobility. And the success of people like Micheal Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, and other top athletes, entertainers, and influencers was evidence of this. The struggle for equality was over in a lot of minds. If they can do it, why can't all of you? Even affluent Black people who were often already distanced from Black communities internalized these kinds of sentiments. However, changing a few laws had not magically transformed an entire society built on the myth of white supremacy. So if racism is no longer the issue it used to be, but many in Black communities continue to struggle, the thought was that the problem must be Black people. This further perpetuated the false belief in the perceived criminality inherent in Blackness that had been alive since the days of slavery. Challenges of poverty were seen as evidence of Black biological delinquency. The so-called war on drugs that began in the 70s was treated like a crime issue in the Black community instead of a health issue. Ideas about the Blackness of crime helped to justify mass incarceration as prisons were privatized in the 1980s. This led to many Blacks being convicted of crimes they didn't commit and often over-penalized for crimes that they may have. If there was news that a Black person was shot by the police, the general public sense was that they must have deserved it. Meanwhile, someone like MJ, who might have been a voice for injustices given his status and inclusion into affluent communities, was disconnected from the Black communities and therefore disconnected from the struggle and the cause. We often view desegregation in schools as a completely positive step in the movement towards equality. But the truth is, American colleges didn't fully integrate their athletic programs. When university sports teams desegregated, really only Black athletes were integrated into the white institutions. Black coaches, managers, and those who had experience serving in other leadership roles, for the most part, were not. This gave white-run institutions with more money the best picks of athletes in the Black community without the responsibility of having to integrate Black people into positions of power within those institutions. Furthermore, instead of attending Black colleges, which were often closer in proximity to the communities of color, top Black athletes who began attending the bigger, predominantly white schools moved farther away from the Black community, putting more distance between the Black athlete and the struggle for equality. As William C. Roden puts it in his book, $40 Million Slaves, Jordan chose not to speak on the racial and power dynamics of the NBA and America at large because he does not relate to the struggle, because life was not a struggle for him. Rather, he was whisked down the conveyor belt to massive success. In The Last Dance, President Barack Obama, who worked as a community organizer in Chicago in the 1980s, admits to being somewhat judgmental of Jordan's seeming apathy for the troubling issues that Obama was facing firsthand through the work he was doing at that time. However, he also talks about the dilemma that a lot of Black people like himself, Jordan, and Oprah Winfrey face when they rise to positions of great power and influence, and have the dilemma of finding a balance between speaking out about injustices and not being too controversial. With the success of the Air Jordan brand and Be Like Mike campaign, Jordan and his executive team were literally changing the paradigm for how basketball players would be marketed in the future. With this unprecedented success and the absence of a clear connection to a cause, the decision to remain neutral is perhaps easier to understand. The difference between now and the 90s is not so much that anything changed, but that the injustices came back to the forefront due to the rise of social media. Viral videos of Blacks being murdered by law enforcement have exposed the racial challenges that continue to exist and have reignited a sense of indignation amongst those on the side of equality. Like in the 50s and 60s, the cause is clear. Athletes like LeBron have been vocal about efforts to right the wrongs of the Jordan generation that did very little with the platform they had been given to move the needle forward in the fight for racial justice. To whom much is given, much is required. As we've been able to relive the glory days of the Jordan era through The Last Dance, we've been reminded how his ability, work ethic, and drive was every bit as epic as we remember it. But it also leaves us with something to question. Like what someone a little bit more indignant, a little bit more conscious, a little bit more connected to the challenges of the Black community in America might have been able to accomplish at that time. Rodin in $40 Million Slaves puts it like this. Jordan was a marketing maven who never capitalized on his potential to mobilize African American athletes. Had he said jump, they would have jumped. Instead, he chose to remain publicly neutral in all matters political and racial. The essence of Jordan's legacy is what he accomplished. The tragedy is what he could have done. I'm Wendy-Ann Clarke, and this is Color Commentary. Want to see more content like this? Why not go ahead and subscribe to this channel?